In the third week of September 1950, the USS Rodman, a converted destroyer minesweeper assigned to the Pacific Fleet, sailed in slow parallel lines 6 to 12 miles off the coast of San Francisco. For 6 consecutive days, the ship's crew operated specialized spray equipment mounted on deck that released a fine aerosol mist into the prevailing onshore wind. The mist contained 2 substances. One was a fluorescent powder used as a tracer. The other was a living organism, Serratia marcescens, a rod-shaped bacterium capable of surviving in the respiratory tract, capable of causing pneumonia, urinary tract infection, and endocarditis, and chosen for this operation specifically because it produced a red pigment that made it easy to identify in laboratory samples taken from surfaces, air filters, and human patients in the target area. The target area was the city of San Francisco. Its 775,000 residents had not been informed. They had not consented. The United States Army had not sought or obtained any legal authority to conduct what it was conducting. The operation was classified under the Army's Special Operations Division Biological Warfare Testing Program, and the decision to execute it had been made at a level that involved no civilian oversight, no congressional notification, and no medical ethics review of any kind. The spray drifted onshore. It moved through the neighborhoods of the Sunset District and the Richmond. It settled on Fisherman's Wharf and the Embarcadero. It entered the ventilation systems of office buildings in the financial district. By the end of the week, Army monitoring stations positioned throughout the city had confirmed that the aerosol had achieved penetration across nearly all of San Francisco's 49 square miles. The operation was logged as a success. 11 days after the spray began, a 75-year-old retired pipe fitter named Edward Nevin was admitted to Stanford University Hospital with a urinary tract infection that was not responding to standard treatment. His condition deteriorated. He developed bacterial endocarditis, an infection of the heart's inner lining. He died 3 weeks later. Hospital laboratory cultures of his blood identified the causative organism as Serratia marcescens. 10 other patients at the same hospital were diagnosed with Serratia marcescens infections in the weeks that followed. None of them had any prior exposure history that could account for the sudden appearance of this particular bacterium in a clinical population that had never seen it in those numbers before. Edward Nevin's family would not learn the truth for 26 years. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. Now back to San Francisco, and to how long it took for any of this to become a matter of public record. To understand what the Army was doing off the coast of San Francisco in 1950, we have to go back not to the Cold War threat environment that the official justification eventually cited, but to a program that had been running inside the United States military since 1943, operating without public knowledge, targeting American civilians on American soil for 7 years before a single newspaper printed a word of it. The Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland, had been established during the Second World War to develop biological warfare capabilities. Its public mandate was defensive, understand the threat in order to counter it. Its actual operations, as revealed through Freedom of Information Act requests beginning in the late 1970s, extended well beyond defense into offensive testing. The deliberate release of biological and chemical agents in populated areas of the United States to study dispersal patterns, atmospheric behavior, and the rate at which an aerosol weapon could saturate an urban environment without the population being aware it was happening. The logic, as Army documents from the period describe it, was straightforward. You could not design an effective biological weapon without knowing how such a weapon behaved in real urban conditions, in the specific wind, patterns, humidity levels, street canyon geometries, and population densities of actual American cities. A laboratory could tell you how a bacterium survived in a petri dish. Only a live test in a real city could tell you how quickly it reached the top floors of a 12-story building, how far it penetrated into subway tunnels, and how many people a single ship offshore could infect before anyone noticed anything was wrong. San Francisco was selected first for specific reasons. It had a dense, compact geography. Its prevailing winds moved reliably onshore from the west. Its hills created dispersal patterns that the Army's meteorological consultants believed would maximize the aerosol's penetration into residential neighborhoods, and it had a major naval installation, the Presidio, which provided a secure operational coordination point within the city perimeter without requiring any civilian liaison. San Francisco was not the last, not by a significant margin. Minneapolis, 1953. The Army's Chemical Corps released zinc cadmium sulfide, a compound containing cadmium, a heavy metal now classified as a human carcinogen, from aircraft and rooftop blowers over residential neighborhoods in the city. The release was described in internal Army documents as a vulnerability test. Residents of the targeted neighborhoods were not told. The releases continued intermittently through 1954. The Army conducted similar operations in Winnipeg, Canada during the same period without notifying the Canadian government. St. Louis, 1953 to 1954. The Army's Chemical Corps operated spraying equipment from rooftops in low-income residential neighborhoods on the city's north side, releasing zinc cadmium sulfide in concentrated quantities. The neighborhoods selected were predominantly African American. Army planning documents from the period described the selection criteria as including population density and the presence of multifamily residential buildings that would maximize indoor penetration of the aerosol. A researcher named Lisa Martino Taylor, who spent years studying the St. Louis operations through declassified Army records, documented in her 2012 doctoral dissertation at the University of Missouri that the cadmium sulfide releases in St. Louis were sometimes combined with a radioactive tracer compound, and that Army records of the full chemical composition of the aerosols released over the city remain partially classified to the present day. New York City, 1966. The Army released Bacillus subtilis variant Niger, a bacterium the Army characterized as a benign simulant, into the New York City subway system by dropping light bulbs filled with the agent onto the tracks at 7 stations, where passing trains dispersed the organism through 87 miles of tunnel in under 24 hours. The test simulated the effects of a biological attack on an urban transit system, the One. 2 million daily passengers using those lines on the days of the testing were not informed. The operation was documented in an Army report titled Vulnerability of Populated Areas to Biological Attack, completed in 1966 and declassified in 1993. Corpus Christi, Texas, 1957. The Army's Chemical Corps released an aerosol of zinc cadmium sulfide over the city and surrounding coastal areas from low-flying aircraft during nighttime hours, measuring dispersal rates across a population of approximately 180,000 people. The city was selected because its flat coastal geography and consistent sea breeze provided meteorological conditions that the Army's models predicted would produce maximum dispersal efficiency. No public health authority in Texas was notified. The operation produced no contemporary news coverage. It appears in the Army's own retrospective documentation of the program, published in 1977 as part of a congressional inquiry, in a table listing 33 separate domestic test operations conducted between 1949 and 196. 33 domestic test operations on American soil against American civilians across 19 years. This is not a theory. The documents exist. Many are available through the National Archives. Others were obtained through FOIA requests by journalists and researchers beginning in the late 1970s. The pattern they describe repeats across nearly 2 decades, with a consistency that the Army's own records make impossible to characterize as isolated incidents. But here is what makes the San Francisco operation different from every other city on that table of 33. Edward Nevin's family fought for that difference to be named in a federal court of law, and what the court record produced is the most precise public documentation of what the government knew and when it knew it of any operation in the entire program. In 1976, a San Francisco Chronicle investigative reporter named Drew Pearson published the results of a FOIA investigation that first brought the 1950 San Francisco operation into public knowledge. The story named the operation, named the bacterium, and named the ship. Edward Nevin's grandson, also named Edward Nevin, then an attorney, read the article and recognized his grandfather's death in it immediately. He filed a lawsuit against the United States government in federal court in San Francisco in 1977, alleging wrongful death and demanding that the government acknowledge responsibility for his grandfather's death from Serratia marcescens infection, 11 days after the army had saturated the city with Serratia marcescens. The case went to trial. The government's defense rested on two arguments. First, that it could not be proven with medical certainty that the specific organism that killed Edward Nevin Sr. had come from the army's spray rather than from some other environmental source. Second, that the army had acted within its legal authority as defined by its own internal guidelines, which did not require civilian notification or consent for testing operations of this kind. Federal District Judge Samuel Conti ruled for the government in 1981. He found that the plaintiff could not establish causation with sufficient certainty and that the Army's actions, whatever their ethical dimensions, did not constitute the kind of legal wrong for which the government had waived sovereign immunity. Edward Nevin III appealed. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the District Court ruling in 1984. The case ended there. The United States government has never issued a formal apology to the family of Edward Nevin. It has never issued a formal apology to the residents of San Francisco. The Army has never adequately addressed several specific questions arising from the documented record of its domestic biological testing program. It has never explained by what legal authority it determined that American citizens could be exposed to live biological agents without their knowledge or consent, and under whose civilian authority, if any, that determination was reviewed before any individual operation was executed. It has never explained why the selection criteria for the St. Louis testing locations, as documented in its own planning records, included the racial composition of residential neighborhoods as a relevant factor in determining where carcinogen-containing aerosols would be released. It has never explained why the full chemical composition of the aerosols released over St. Louis between 1953 and 1954 remains partially classified more than 70 years after the operations were conducted, if the substances used posed no public health risk. Why would a government that characterized its biological testing program as a defensive research effort require that the test subjects, the residents of Minneapolis, St. Louis, San Francisco, and New York, not know they were test subjects, unless the program would not have survived the scrutiny of people who understood what was being done to them? Why would Army planning documents for the St. Louis operations identify the racial demographics of target neighborhoods as a selection criterion if population density were truly the only variable that mattered? Why does the Army's own FOIA release documentation of these programs contain systematic gaps in the years between 1958 and 1965, the precise window during which, according to the program's own internal chronology, the operations were at their most extensive? That is not a coincidence, that is a pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee that investigated intelligence and military abuses between 1975 and 1976, documented the domestic biological testing program in its final report. The committee's report named Fort Detrick, named the Special Operations Division, and confirmed that American citizens had been exposed to biological agents without consent on multiple occasions over multiple decades. Senator Frank Church stated publicly that the committee had found evidence of practices so contrary to American values that it was difficult to explain how they had been sustained for so long without any oversight mechanism identifying them. The committee recommended new legal frameworks and new oversight structures. Several were enacted. What the Church Committee could not explain, and what its report does not address, is how the operations had remained entirely unknown to the civilian leadership of the cities where they were conducted. Not one mayor of San Francisco, Minneapolis, St. Louis, or New York was ever briefed. Not one city health department was notified before, during, or after any individual operation. The Army's own operational security protocols, as described in its internal planning documents, explicitly prohibited any contact with local civilian authorities. The reasoning given in those documents was that local notification would compromise operational security. The actual effect was that no civilian authority with the standing to object was ever given the opportunity to do so. The testing program, as publicly documented through declassified records and FOIA releases, ran from 1950 through at least 1969, when President Nixon issued an executive order ending the offensive biological weapons program. Whether all components of the domestic testing program ended in 1969, or whether the declassified record represents the full extent of what was conducted, is a question that the available documents do not definitively answer. San Francisco is still there. The neighborhoods of the Sunset and the Richmond, Fisherman's Wharf and the Embarcadero, the financial district ventilation shafts, they are all still there. If you go to the National Archives today and request the Army Special Operations Division files from September 1950, you will find the operational reports for the San Francisco test. They are available. They describe the ship's track, the spray duration, the atmospheric conditions, and the penetration results. They do not mention Edward Nevin. They were not written for him. The official history tells us that the Cold War required extraordinary measures, and that the Army's biological testing program, whatever its ethical shortcomings, was a product of a different era operating under different assumptions. What the operational reports, the hospital admission records, the FOIA documents from Minneapolis and St. Louis and New York, and Edward Nevin III's federal lawsuit together tell us is that the government of the United States made a deliberate decision in 1950 and for nearly 2 decades afterward that the health and lives of its own citizens were an acceptable variable in a military experiment, and that the legal and institutional structures that should have prevented that decision had been arranged so that no one with the authority to stop it was ever informed it was happening. These stories survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. History doesn't disappear when it's buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I'm going further into Fort Detrick and to a 1969 inventory conducted when Nixon ordered the program shut down. Researchers who requested the inventory through FOIA found that it listed agents that the Army's own public program history claims were never developed. One entry describes a compound with a name that appears nowhere else in any declassified American document. Nowhere except one, a 1971 memo from the National Security Council. You won't want to miss it.